Today we're going to talk about learning through seeing and learning through observing, how some of the most elite performers in the world are going to be able to refine their skills faster and push themselves away from the competition through certain tactics and techniques to learning, and how you might be able to implement them in your own mental skills game. A brief bit of history around kind of action observation research, where some of this research came from, and a few of the more theoretical pieces. Just a quick note, this is a much less theoretical lecture than last week. So last week when we went into kind of mechanisms of action, we're not going to talk about that for as much today. Right, the first thing we have to talk about when we talk about learning through observation is a little thing called a mirror neuron. So a mirror neuron, some of you might have heard of it before, is basically a neuron that sits in our brain in like a motor cortex or an area of the brain associated with movement. And when we observe movement, so when we visually see somebody doing a movement, those mirror neurons in our brain fire in the same pattern a motor neuron would fire in the brain. A quick real-time example of a mirror neuron in action would be somebody learning how to hammer a nail. So when we see somebody hammering in a nail, we'll watch that. And the same kind of motor neurons, or those motor pathways in our brain that are activated when we're hammering in a nail, are going to be activated when we observe somebody hammering in a nail. So something as simple as a child observing their parent picking up a cup or taking a drink from a cup is going to have an activation pathway in the brain similar to as if the child was doing that movement themselves. The story behind the genesis of the mirror neuron hypothesis is actually a quite interesting one. It involves some macaque monkeys and a few psychology professors having their lunch. Typically when you do studies on neural activity, and particularly when you do them in monkey populations or animal testing populations, you will insert an electrode into a particular part of the brain. So an electrode will go in, they'll get the monkey to do some motor movements, and in this case they were getting the monkey to do movements associated with eating. So things like picking up a banana and eating it, they'd observe that motor pattern in the brain, so the electrical firing of different areas of the brain. When these professors were having, or these researchers were having their lunch, they left the electrodes inserted in the monkey's brain because it was just, they're taking a quick 20-minute break to have their lunch, and the professors started eating their lunch. It just so happened when they retroactively looked at the data after lunchtime, they had been recording data the whole way through. And as the monkey was watching the researcher eat his banana, that same motor pattern in the brain, the pattern of electrical firing, was the identical motor pattern that they had when the monkey was eating himself. The areas of the brain primarily kind of being involved here are the premotor frontal cortex, the motor frontal cortex, where the parietal lobe meets the temporal lobe, so an area typically kind of assigned for vision and for concentration. These are all areas that are happening when we're doing the movement themselves. Evolutionarily, this makes a lot of sense. Humans and primates are very, very good at learning from each other, so observing something happening and then them being able to do the movement themselves. There's been big links between, so they do tests where, the example I gave earlier, where you reach out and grab a cup of coffee and drink from it, they'll have, obviously in humans they don't insert electrodes, they will use an EEG machine on their head and they can pick it up through the scalp. So when you do that test with a human and you pick up a cup of coffee, obviously they see activation in appropriate parts of the brain. An interesting note here, when they do these studies in humans, they use like an EEG machine. It picks up activation through the scalp. So in the same way they inserted the electrodes into the monkey's brain, they're obviously not doing that in a human context. There are differences though between monkeys and humans, although in some humans it may be more difficult to pick out than others. But one area is in the kind of empathy side of things when we look at mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are quite strange, right? In a monkey population or an animal population, if I pick up that cup of coffee and a monkey observes me doing it, he will get that same triggering and the activation in certain areas of the brain. If I then go to pick up that coffee with a tool, there is a difference in the magnitude of activation, but also in the areas that are activated. We don't see these same changes when we look at human interaction and human activation. So if a human observes somebody picking something up with a tool, they still get that activation. This is obviously incredibly interesting because it appears as though the human brain is being activated just in case we can learn. So we don't have a direct context of how we might be able to use this tool or how we might be able to do that motor pattern because we haven't used that tool before, but we're still activating the brain just in case there's something there. Right, so getting away from action observation in the very kind of theoretical sense of things, how does this impact us in elite sport? Obviously, we can see how it might impact us with developing athletes, with youth athletes, that they're going to observe expert models, they are going to observe parental models or peer models, and then be able to learn a movement faster. They will start hashing out those patterns of activation in the brain faster. But how can elite athletes use this? It's very, very likely that elite athletes are using this all the time, but they might be using it in combination with one or two other strategies to make it even more effective. So obviously elite athletes watch other high performers, they watch their own performances back again. And it mightn't just be a thing of watching our own performances back again in order to develop better cueing strategies, to develop better tactical strategies, to see where deficits or surpluses in our strengths may lie. But we could actually be watching back footage purely to learn how to do the movement better. If we take, for example, a weightlifter isn't going to be able to do more than a certain amount of snatches above 80 or 90% each week in training. It will just fatigue them too much. There'll be too much wear and tear on the body, and they're not going to be able to progress by doing that. But if you have a weightlifter whereby you're trying to alter a motor pattern, so I'm trying to bring about a technical change, so it's a non-physiological change. I might be using cues to do that in training. A lot of you will be very familiar with these. I can then use a strategy where action observation and the kind of triggering of those mirror neurons can shorten my time to learn the skill and might be able to embed that new motor pattern faster. Right, so we spoke about tactics or other things this might be involved with, or how we might combine this into a mental skill strategy. And one of the emerging kind of areas in this field is the combination of action observation with mental imagery. And mental imagery is this kind of quasi-perceptual experience. So mental imagery, a lot of the time people will think is like imagining a picture in your brain. People will talk about it being seeing through your mind's eye. It just so happens mental imagery is just more than about a visual experience. Mental imagery is imagining the entire environment in which you are placed. It's imagining the way in which you feel. It's imagining the perceived emotions that are happening. So when you talk to Olympians and their mental imagery routines, they're never just talking about how a competition arena looks. They're talking about the air temperature. They're talking about the feeling underneath their feet. When they're doing these drills, they commonly talk about the sense of excitement or the sense of anxious nervousness. They talk about interactions with others and how those interactions make them feel. So it's this multi-sensory activity that goes far beyond just imagining an image or a video playing in your brain. If I then was an athlete or a coach and I wanted to implement something like AOMI, action observation and mental imagery, how would I go about doing this? So the first thing to look into is I need to make sure that action observation is correct and it's applicable to the athlete. So this is very clear, right? I don't get a soccer player to watch a rugby player kick a ball because it's a different shaped ball. They kick the ball differently. The goal and the outcome is different. But I also shouldn't be getting a soccer player to watch a soccer player of another team do an incorrect technique. Or if I'm a weightlifter, I shouldn't be looking at weightlifters who have inferior technique or a technique that's just different from somebody of my morphology. So if I'm a tall lifter or you're a tall lifter, you should be watching other tall lifters with effective technique. Unfortunately, this means you should probably stop watching weightlifters with bad technique. And not to name anyone or name any countries, but certain areas of weightlifting have incredibly bad habits. And watching these bad habits can actually lead to you developing these habits in your own training. So even though you might be the coach who's saying, oh, I wish athlete X would stop watching athlete Y because they think they should do this, it could be a much more deeply rooted issue where it's not just a habit they're picking up intentionally. They could be building a motor pattern in their head of an ineffective technique or an ineffective way of moving without them even realizing it. The mental imagery part then is a small bit more nuanced, but by no means is it out of reach for a lot of coaches and a lot of athletes. When I spoke earlier about mental imagery being this kind of multi-dimensional aspect, so we're really imagining everything that's happening during a performance, it's important that we kind of tailor that to the athlete themselves. So if I'm somebody who pays very little attention to my physical surroundings, there's no point in me having a very visually active mental imagery training session. What I should be doing then is focusing on the feelings or other things that might cue me more or spur me on more. There's a very easy way of figuring this out. We can use something called the VMIQ2. VMIQ2 stands for Vividness of Movement Imagery Questionnaire, version 2. It will basically allow coaches or athletes to figure out, look, is this person more visually aware? Are they more kinesthetically aware? And it will just allow you to flesh out and kind of see, okay, this athlete might prefer certain wording in their scripting of mental imagery. This athlete might prefer something slightly different. So it's very nuanced. It's a very individualized process. And it's important, if you're bringing something like a mental imagery training session into an athlete's program or into your own program, you have to be aware that this has to be applicable to you, and it can't just be some cookie cutter program. Okay, in the next coming weeks, we're going to talk about mental imagery sessions in particular, and possibly the combination of action, observation and mental imagery, and how you can program these sessions for yourself or for your athlete. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Hopefully you got some value from the information here. If you have any questions, pop them in the comments below. And as always, it would be great if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel.